He stopped saying sorry. The day he realized it had become his leash. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't arrogance. It was exhaustion, the kind that doesn't come from work, but from years of kneeling before people who never intended to forgive him. I used to think apologies made me a better man, but I see now they only made me easier to control. The first time I said sorry, I was 6. I had broken a glass. My mother's voice trembled with anger, not because of the glass, but because of something deeper, something unspoken. I said, "I'm sorry, Mom." And she smiled, just a little. That smile burned itself into my memory. It was the first time I learned that remorse was currency, that guilt could buy peace. So I kept paying. By the time I turned 25, sorry was stitched into my vocabulary like a nervous tick. I said sorry when people interrupted me. I said sorry when I was right. I said sorry when I felt too much, wanted too much, or simply existed in someone's disapproval. It became a reflex, not a kindness, but a fear. Fear that someone might withdraw affection. Fear that conflict might expose me. Fear that silence might turn into rejection. I built a life of polite slavery, smiling while apologizing for my own heartbeat. There's a kind of violence in always wanting to be forgiven. It doesn't look like blood or bruises. It looks like someone whispering, "No, it's fine," while their soul quietly dissolves. You stop defending your truth because you start believing your truth itself is offensive. Apologies become your armor, but the kind that only fits if you shrink enough to wear it. Every sorry becomes a small death, a surrender dressed in virtue. And the worst part? People love you for it. They call you kind, empathetic, easy to be around. But what they really mean is, you're easy to control. I remember one night, rain sliding down my apartment window, the kind of rain that sounds like it's trying to apologize for falling. I had just hung up the phone after another fight that ended with me apologizing, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. I stood there, staring at the reflection in the glass, my own face dim and distant. I mouthed the word again, sorry, and for the first time, it sounded disgusting. I realized I didn't even know what I was apologizing for anymore. Existing, maybe, feeling too deeply, expecting too much humanity from people who had none left to give. That night, I wrote something on a torn piece of paper. Every apology you offer without conviction makes you smaller. I stared at it for hours. It felt cruel, but it was true. And truth, I was beginning to learn, is rarely gentle. They tell you that apologizing makes you mature, that it takes strength to admit fault. But what if you're not at fault? What if the world has trained you to apologize for your boundaries, your silence, your needs, your very presence? That's when the apology becomes a ritual of submission, a ceremony of guilt to appease others' comfort. And the more you practice it, the more you disappear. I once dated someone who said, "You're too polite, it's kind of sad." I laughed, but something inside me cracked, because I knew she was right. I was polite the way prisoners are obedient. When I finally stumbled upon Machiavelli's The Prince, I expected politics. But I found psychology. He wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." At first, I hated that line. It felt monstrous. But over time, I began to understand what he meant. Love without boundaries is manipulation waiting to happen. Fear, at least, commands respect. Machiavelli never said, "Don't care." He said, "Stop begging." He said, "Lead." And in a world where everyone apologizes for being themselves, leadership starts with silence, the refusal to bow for approval. My father once told me, never say sorry twice. If they didn't forgive you the first time, the second time isn't for them. It's for your guilt. I didn't listen. I spent years apologizing to people who fed on guilt like wine. It made them feel powerful, as if my remorse proved their worth. They mistook my humility for weakness, and I let them, because I thought being forgiven was the same as being loved. It isn't. Forgiveness, in the wrong hands, is a leash tied to your throat. Sometimes the cost of peace is too high. Sometimes you have to let the world call you cold, arrogant, even cruel, just to protect the small, quiet truth of who you are. Because if you keep apologizing for that truth, One day you'll wake up and realize you've erased yourself in the name of being good. I once read that in ancient Rome, generals who lost wars would kneel before the emperor, confess their failures, and beg for mercy. Some were spared. Most were executed. Apologies didn't save them. They simply confirmed guilt, even when they had none. And I wondered, how many of us live like that now, kneeling before the court of others' opinions, waiting for a mercy that never comes? You start noticing things once you stop apologizing. The way people flinch when you say no without explanation. The way manipulators lose power when you don't defend yourself. The way silence becomes heavy, almost sacred. At first, it feels wrong, like rebellion. But then you realize it's peace. The kind that doesn't beg. The kind that doesn't explain. That's when I understood what Machiavelli meant by strength. Not violence. Not arrogance. Just clarity. The kind that makes you immune to emotional debt. But let me tell you something they never warn you about. When you stop apologizing, people will hate you. Not because you've done wrong, but because you've broken the unspoken contract of submission. They'll call you heartless, uncompromising. They'll say, you've changed. And they'll be right. Because freedom always looks like arrogance to those still enslaved by guilt. I remember sitting alone one evening, coffee gone cold beside me, when I wrote another line in that same torn notebook. To stop apologizing is to start mourning the person who always needed approval. I read it back and felt grief, real grief, like I had just buried someone. Because I had. The version of me that existed only to be forgiven was finally gone. And in its place, there was silence. Heavy, strange, powerful silence. That was the night I began to practice what I now call the never sorry rule. Not pride. Not cruelty, just refusal. The refusal to bend my spine for validation. I didn't owe anyone an explanation anymore. If I made a mistake, I fixed it. Quietly. If I was misunderstood, I let them misunderstand. Because the moment you start explaining your worth, you've already lost it. Most people apologize not for what they did, but for how others felt. And feelings, I learned, are the easiest things in the world to weaponize. If someone wants control, all they need is to look hurt, and your reflex will do the rest. It's not kindness, it's conditioning. We are trained from childhood to fear disappointment more than dishonesty, so we apologize not to repair, but to avoid abandonment. There's something poetic about that. The same word meant to heal connection becomes a tool that destroys it, because you can't build respect on surrender. And that's what every false apology is. Surrender dressed as virtue. That's where my transformation began. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in understanding that guilt, when misplaced, is the softest poison. And I drank it for years. There's a reason the word sorry feels lighter than truth. It's not meant to heal, it's meant to sedate. Apologies are anesthesia for discomfort, a numbing agent for confrontation. But pain avoided is power surrendered. I learned that every time I said sorry without meaning it, I wasn't soft, I was scared. And fear has perfect manners. It bows, it whispers, it explains. It offers itself in exchange for safety that never truly arrives. Apologies, at their core, are about control. We think they're about morality, but they're about hierarchy, who gets to feel righteous and who gets to kneel. In every interaction where someone demands an apology, one person is saying, I will feel clean only if you feel dirty first. And so we comply. We wash others with our guilt. We scrub their insecurities with our surrender, until there's nothing left of us but a faint reflection, someone who exists only to absorb the discomfort of others. When I began studying human behavior, I found something chilling. Apologies in psychology trigger a dopamine release. Not in the one who gives them, but in the one who receives them. It's reward circuitry. The brain learns, when I am wronged and I apologize, I win. It's a hit of emotional superiority. And like any high, it needs repetition. That's why some people never stop finding reasons to be offended. They're addicted to being apologized to. They need someone to kneel to prove their feelings matter. They need a villain, and they'll cast you as one just to keep their self-image intact. Think about it. We live in an era obsessed with public apologies. Celebrities, brands, politicians, all bow before the altar of collective outrage. not to fix anything, but to maintain the illusion of moral order. It's not about forgiveness. It's about displaying submission. The ritual must be seen, the kneeling, the remorse, the scripted humility, because the crowd doesn't crave truth. It craves confession. And confession in the wrong hands is entertainment. Once you start seeing it, it's everywhere. At work, when someone takes blame to keep the peace. In relationships, when one partner apologizes for wanting attention. In families where silence is bought with guilt. We live in an economy of emotion, and sorry is its cheapest currency. The price? Self-respect. I remember an old colleague once told me, if you say sorry too often, people stop hearing it. They just start expecting it. He was right. Apologies lose meaning when they're used to control tension instead of repair truth. Eventually, they become background noise, like a fan running in a room you've lived in too long. You don't even notice it's draining you. There's a strange kind of moral theater in our species. We crave innocence so badly that we'll fake guilt just to feel pure again. It's why people apologize for things they didn't do. They'd rather be seen as good than be free. But goodness, when performed, is just obedience in disguise. The roots of this run deep. From childhood, most of us are taught that being good means being agreeable. You break something, you say sorry. You speak too loudly, you say sorry. You question authority, you say sorry again. Not because you were wrong, but because adults don't like discomfort. So we grow up associating peace with submission. And then we wonder why adulthood feels like walking on glass. I once saw a mother scold her son in a park. He had cried after being bullied by another kid. The mother said, "Go say sorry for crying." I froze, because that was the moment I realized this isn't just habit, it's inheritance. We're teaching generations to apologize for pain, to suppress emotion, to bury anger, to trade authenticity for acceptance. And then we call it emotional intelligence. But that's not intelligence. That's emotional self-erasure. Machiavelli saw this centuries ago. He understood that people would rather appear virtuous than actually be free. He knew guilt was a tool, a chain you can wrap around a nation's neck and call it morality. He didn't despise kindness. He despised weakness masquerading as virtue. And in that sense, never sorry wasn't arrogance. It was strategy, a refusal to let emotion become leverage. Imagine a ruler constantly apologizing to his subjects. Would they respect him or sense blood in the water? Machiavelli knew that once power kneels, it never rises again. But what he didn't write, what I've learned the hard way, is that this rule applies not just to rulers, but to hearts. When your spirit kneels too often, your confidence forgets how to stand. I once loved someone who demanded constant reassurance. She'd say, "You don't care anymore," and I'd panic, scrambling for words to fix her insecurity. Every reassurance became an apology. Every silence became guilt. Until I wasn't loving her anymore, I was managing her emotions. And that's when it hit me. Some people don't want connection. They want control dressed as affection. And they'll use your guilt to get it. There's a difference between responsibility and guilt. Responsibility says, "I'll make it right." Guilt says, "I am wrong for existing this way." One heals, the other chains. But we confuse the two because guilt feels moral. It feels righteous. We think pain equals purity. So we carry guilt like saints dragging crosses, hoping someone will notice how good we are. But goodness that destroys you isn't goodness. It's obedience. The most dangerous part of guilt is that it disguises itself as empathy. You start believing you're apologizing because you care. But real empathy doesn't need self-erasure. Real empathy listens, understands, repairs, but it never kneels. If your empathy costs your dignity, it's not empathy. It's emotional debt. When I finally stopped apologizing for everything, the silence was unbearable. No one told me this part. They talk about confidence as if it's fireworks, loud, glorious, liberating. But it isn't. It's quiet. So quiet it terrifies you. Because suddenly, there's no one left to validate you. And you realize that's what all the apologies were for. Validation. Permission to exist. I began to study people who rarely apologize, not narcissists, but balanced, grounded individuals. They were calm. They didn't rush to defend themselves. When they were wrong, they said so plainly, I was wrong. No groveling, no theatrics, just ownership. And when they weren't wrong, they stayed silent. That silence wasn't arrogance. It was discipline, a quiet understanding that truth doesn't need decoration. The difference between guilt and integrity is that integrity doesn't beg to be believed. It just is. You can feel it in a person's tone, the steadiness of someone who doesn't barter their self-worth for approval. They don't chase forgiveness because they know their intent was clean. And if someone still wants to crucify them for it, that's no longer their burden to carry. Machiavelli's principle, never apologize for power, was never about cruelty. It was about preservation. Because in every relationship, personal or political, the one who apologizes first forfeits psychological territory. Not every time, but enough times that it matters. When you apologize too often, people stop listening to your intent and start expecting your surrender. And once surrender becomes your identity, recovery feels like betrayal, even to yourself. I remember a friend once told me, "You've changed. You're colder now." I smiled, because she was right. They say every philosophy is born from heartbreak, that no one questions their nature until something or someone breaks them open. For me, that person was her. I don't remember the exact day we met, only that it was raining again, the kind of rain that doesn't fall, it whispers. We were both in the same coffee shop, the air thick with the scent of damn books and burnt espresso. She sat alone near the window, black coat, unread expression. There was something about her stillness. It wasn't cold. It was deliberate. When our eyes met, she didn't smile. Most people smile out of politeness, a reflex to say, I'm harmless. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke fluently in a language I hadn't yet learned, certainty. We started talking days later. Small conversations at first, the kind that drift between books, music, and meaningless observations. But every time I spoke, I noticed something. She never apologized. Not once. Not for being late. Not for disagreeing. Not even when her words cut sharp enough to sting. She said what she meant, and then stopped. No fillers. No cushioning. Her sentences ended with periods. Not guilt. It was unnerving. Because I was still the kind of man who said sorry for taking up space. One evening, I spilled a bit of coffee across the table and instantly muttered, sorry. She looked up from her book, eyes steady, voice calm. Why? The question froze me. It's just habit, I guess. She nodded slowly. You apologize like it's punctuation. I laughed it off, but inside, I felt exposed, like she had seen through years of polite armor with one glance. Over the next few weeks, I watched her more closely. She wasn't rude. She wasn't careless. In fact, she was deeply empathetic. But her empathy had edges. It didn't bend. It stood tall. She could listen without absorbing pain. She could care without collapsing under it. And that terrified me, because it was everything I wasn't. I had mistaken emotional availability for goodness. But she was teaching me that real goodness requires boundaries. One night, we walked through the city, quiet streets, dim lights, the sound of rain collecting in forgotten corners. We talked about trust, about fear, about the weight of being human. At some point, I said, I just hate conflict. I'd rather say sorry and move on. She stopped walking, turned to me. Then you'll spend your life apologizing to people who enjoy conflict more than peace. Her words landed like thunder in slow motion, because I knew she was right. I wasn't avoiding conflict. I was avoiding myself, avoiding the part of me that wanted to stand tall and say, no. She told me something that night I never forgot. Apologies are supposed to be bridges, not chains. But people like you keep building them to the wrong side. That line haunted me, because it was true. I built bridges to people who loved watching me walk across just to burn them behind me. As time passed, she became my mirror, calm, unsparing, precise. And through her, I began to see the hidden truth. The people who love your apologies are rarely the ones who love you. They love the comfort you provide when you kneel. They love the power of being right, even when they're wrong. They love the illusion of moral victory. But love that depends on your submission isn't love. It's consumption. One evening, we argued, our first real argument. I don't even remember what started it. Maybe something trivial. But I remember what ended it. She said, "You're apologizing again. Stop doing that. It's not helping." I snapped back, "I'm just trying to make peace." Her eyes hardened. Peace doesn't come from surrender. It comes from clarity. That silence afterward was heavy. Not angry, just alive. I realized then that all my life, I've been confusing surrender for resolution. And maybe that's why I never felt peace that lasted. She wasn't cruel. She never raised her voice. But she carried a kind of stillness that demanded truth. It wasn't arrogance. It was alignment. Every word she spoke came from a place I had never accessed. Self-respect without hostility. That's when I understood something profound. Confidence isn't loud. It's simply the absence of apology. We started spending nights in quiet conversation, the kind that strips pretense from people. She told me stories of moments she refused to apologize, even when it cost her relationships, jobs, comfort. But she said it with peace, not pride. "People think not apologizing makes you selfish," she said one night. "But sometimes it's the only way to stay honest." I asked, "Doesn't it hurt to lose people over that?" She looked at me, expression soft but firm. "It hurts more to lose yourself." Her presence began to alter me in small, invisible ways. I stopped rushing to fill silences. I stopped apologizing when someone misunderstood my intentions. I started noticing how often people manipulate through disappointment. How a sigh, a frown, a pause can become a leash. And I began cutting those invisible strings one by one. It wasn't easy. It felt like tearing skin off my soul. Because guilt is addictive. It gives you identity, purpose, belonging. When you stop being guilty, you feel empty for a while, but then you start feeling free. There was a night, one I can't forget. We sat on a rooftop, city lights stretching like scattered stars beneath us. She said, "You know, apologies are like rain. Necessary sometimes, but too much and you drown the roots." I asked, "So what's the right amount?" She smiled faintly. "Enough to keep things alive, not enough to lose yourself." And in that moment, something inside me shifted, like the final lock of an old door clicking open. I began to test this new version of myself in the world. At work, I stopped apologizing for ideas that were right. In conversations, I let silence exist without patching it. When people tried to guilt me into compliance, I let their discomfort return to them. And the strangest thing happened. The world didn't end. In fact, people started treating me differently. With caution, with respect, sometimes even admiration. Because nothing unsettles manipulators more than someone who refuses to feel guilty. It wasn't all victories, though. Some people drifted away. Friends who were used to my constant softness now called me distant. Family members said I'd become too proud. But she told me, let them think that. Every person who only loved you when you were small will leave when you grow. And she was right. Their departure was proof of my evolution. One day, after months of quiet transformation, she told me she was leaving. No explanation, no drama, just a simple truth. My part in your story is done. I didn't beg. I didn't apologize for whatever I thought I did wrong. I just nodded. And for the first time in my life, I let someone go without guilt. No closing speeches. No emotional debt. Just stillness. That night, the city felt louder than usual, or maybe I was just quieter. Days turned into weeks. I thought I'd feel empty, but instead I felt weightless. It was as if all those years of sorry had been stones in my pockets, and someone had finally told me it was okay to drop them. I realized then that she wasn't teaching me to stop apologizing. She was teaching me to stop seeking forgiveness for being human. Because forgiveness, like anything else, can become dependency. And dependency is just another word for imprisonment. Machiavelli once wrote, "Men forget the death of their fathers sooner than the loss of their inheritance." At first, I thought he meant greed, But now I see he meant power. People mourn control more than love. And when you stop apologizing, they lose control. That's why they call you cold. That's why they make you the villain. Because in their story, your boundaries are betrayal. There's a price for self-respect. You'll lose approval. You'll be misunderstood. You'll walk alone for a while. But solitude is a small cost for sovereignty. And as I sat there one last time in that same cafe, looking at the chair where she used to sit, I wrote down one final note in my torn notebook. She didn't teach me how to be loved. She taught me how to stop apologizing for not being loved enough. That line was the turning point. It wasn't about her. It was about me and every version of myself I had betrayed for peace. The days that followed were strangely quiet, not because the world had changed, but because I finally had. I started noticing how often people said, sorry, without reason. A colleague bumping into a chair, sorry. A friend expressing an opinion, sorry. A woman simply existing a little too loudly in a room, sorry. It wasn't an apology anymore. It was a code, a hidden language of submission, disguised as politeness. And I realized every sorry carries a message beneath it. Please don't punish me for being human. That's what we've all been doing, isn't it? Begging for mercy from a world that never asked for our guilt. The more I watched, the more it made sense. Apologies had become the glue that kept society's illusions intact. The illusion of harmony, of goodness, of equality. But deep down, it wasn't harmony. It was hierarchy. People don't apologize to heal. They apologize to belong. And once you see that, once you see how the word sorry is used to trade dignity for acceptance, you can't unsee it. I began testing the world in small ways. When someone interrupted me, I didn't say sorry. When someone dismissed my opinion, I didn't retreat into politeness. When someone tried to guilt me into agreement, I didn't bend. I just watched. And something extraordinary happened. They stopped pushing. They stopped treating my silence as weakness. They stopped assuming my calm was an invitation to walk over me. The world listens differently when you stop apologizing for existing. It doesn't always like you, but it starts to respect you. One evening, I found myself walking to the same park I used to visit after fights, breakups, or guilt-ridden nights. I used to come there to think about how to fix people, how to say the right thing, how to be better. This time, I came to bury something. I stood under the same flickering streetlight that once witnessed my weakest confessions, and I whispered into the cold air, I'm done apologizing for what I didn't destroy. The wind didn't respond, but it didn't need to. That moment wasn't about forgiveness. It was about reclamation. I thought about that man from the cafe, the one who never flinched. I realized now he wasn't heartless. He was free. He'd built a world where guilt had no rent to collect, where every word he spoke was a choice, not a plea. I started reading more about Machiavelli, the man the world calls ruthless. But that's the thing about truth. It always looks cruel to those who depend on lies for comfort. Machiavelli never said, be evil. He said, be effective. He said, if you must be feared or loved, choose fear, because love fades where power bends. And I understood, apologies are not a sign of virtue. They're a leak of power. The more you use them, the weaker your presence becomes, because every unnecessary sorry whispers, I need you to approve of me. And the moment you need approval, you lose command over your own story. But here's the paradox, and maybe the redemption. Not apologizing doesn't mean becoming cruel. It means mastering responsibility. It means knowing when your words wound and fixing what needs fixing without kneeling. It means learning that guilt and empathy are not the same. Empathy is understanding. Guilt is bondage. There's strength and accountability. But apology, as we use it, is not accountability. It's self-erasure. When you say sorry for existing, for wanting, for feeling, for being, you chip away at your identity until there's nothing left but dust that pleases everyone and satisfies no one. Weeks turned into months. I began to rebuild my boundaries, not like walls, but like doors. I learned to open and close them deliberately. When people came into my life, I didn't let their chaos dictate my tone. When they left, I didn't chase them with explanations. I simply said, take care. That's it. No more. No less. And something unexpected happened. Peace. Not the kind that comes from harmony, but the kind that comes from clarity. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of self. And you can't have that if you keep apologizing for the space you occupy. There were days when I still felt the old urge, that reflex to say sorry, just to smooth over silence. But I caught it now. I held it in my throat like a captive breath, and instead of releasing it, I let it die quietly, because some silences deserve to stay unbroken. And every time I resisted the urge to apologize, I felt something grow stronger, a quiet confidence, a pulse of self-respect that didn't need to be proven. It wasn't arrogance. It was equilibrium. I stopped trying to be the good one and started being the real one. One day, I met that man again, the one from the cafe. He looked exactly the same, calm, untouchable, still holding a book. He recognized me instantly. "You stopped apologizing," he said, with the faintest hint of a smile. I nodded. He gestured to the chair across from him, the same one I'd sat in before. This time, I didn't say sorry to interrupt. I just sat down. He closed his book and said, "How does it feel?" I thought about it. Then I said, "Quiet, but not lonely." He smiled again. That's power. Real power is quiet. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. There's a strange understanding between people who both stopped apologizing for who they are. It's not pride. It's mutual recognition. Like two wolves nodding in the dark. As I walked home that night, the city lights blurred into rivers of gold and red. I passed strangers rushing, apologizing, explaining, all of them caught in invisible negotiations for love and peace. And I wondered how long it would take for them to realize what I had, that every sorry has a cost, and that some debts aren't worth paying. When I got home, I wrote one final note to myself. You don't need to be forgiven to be free. And I meant it, because freedom isn't about being right. It's about being real, unapologetically, imperfectly, powerfully you. Clapperboard narrator's final line. The world doesn't remember the ones who kept saying sorry. It remembers the ones who stopped needing to.